The fastest way to lose power is not through defeat, it is through confession. Not the honest kind that clears your conscience and restores your integrity, the careless kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that spills out of you in moments of anxiety, exhaustion, or the desperate need to be understood. That kind of confession does not bring you closer to the people you share it with. It hands them a map of your vulnerabilities, and in competitive environments, maps get used. You have been told your entire life that transparency builds trust, that vulnerability builds connection. That radical honesty dissolves tension and makes you more relatable, more human, more worthy of love and respect. And sometimes, in the right context, with the right people, in the right season of a relationship, all of that is true. Vulnerability between people who have earned each other's loyalty is one of the most powerful bonds human beings can form. It creates depth. It creates intimacy. It creates the kind of friendship that survives decades. But in competitive environments, unfiltered admission becomes something else entirely. It becomes a blueprint for your erosion. It becomes a catalogue of soft spots that others, not always maliciously, but often instinctively, will reference when the pressure rises and their own interests are at stake. The problem is not that people are evil. The problem is that people are strategic, and strategy accelerates when resources become scarce, when promotions are limited, when status is contested, when survival feels immediate. Machiavelli understood something deeply uncomfortable about human nature that most people spend their lives trying to argue against. People forgive mistakes more readily than they forgive weakness. A mistake is an event. It happened, it passed, it can be corrected, it can even become the foundation of a comeback story. But weakness is a condition. Once revealed, it becomes the lens through which all future behavior is interpreted. You perform brilliantly the month after admitting you feel lost, and people call it surprising. You stumble in the month after projecting confidence, and people call it an off day. The frame shapes the perception. The admission sets the frame. And once set, frames are extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Every social environment, without exception, runs on perception. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. Workplaces, friendships, families, romantic relationships, creative communities, even the groups we like to think of as immune to such dynamics. Because they are built on shared values, all of them evaluate their members not only by what those members do, but by what they reveal. And revelation, unlike behavior, does not reset. It accumulates. The human mind is a pattern recognition machine that catalogues information and stores it often beneath the level of conscious awareness. Your fears, your doubts, your insecurities, your dependencies, once expressed, they do not simply evaporate from the consciousness of the people who witnessed them. They become background knowledge that subtly colors every interaction that follows. This is why there are certain things you should never admit carelessly. Not because you should lie about who you are, not because pretense is a sustainable strategy for building anything of substance, but because you should understand consequence. Because wisdom is knowing not just what is true, but when, how, and to whom it is appropriate to share what is true. There is a critical distinction that most people never fully internalize: the difference between your private truth and your public declaration of that truth. Your private truth is sacred. It is the raw material of self-knowledge, the foundation of genuine growth, the honest reckoning with who you are and what you carry. Protecting it from careless exposure is not suppression, it is stewardship. The gardener does not display the roots of every seedling to prove they understand horticulture. The roots exist, they are real, they do the essential work, but they do their work underground, protected from elements that would damage them before the plant has the strength to survive exposure. Your vulnerabilities function in precisely the same way. They are real, they matter, they are part of you. But they are not required to be publicly announced in order to be privately acknowledged and worked through. The first thing you should never admit carelessly is how deeply you crave approval. The desire to be liked, validated, chosen, seen, these are among the most universal of human hungers. There is nothing shameful about wanting to matter to the people around you, but once others understand that approval is the mechanism that drives your behavior, they hold the key to your engine. If someone knows that you need their validation in order to feel secure, they can weaponize it through withholding. They can reward you with attention when you comply, and punish you with distance when you do not, and you will begin, often without realizing it, to adjust your behavior in order to maintain favor. This is where control shifts. Not dramatically, not in a single recognizable moment, but gradually, like a tide that changes the landscape so slowly that you do not notice until the shoreline looks nothing like it did when you arrived. The Stoics practiced what they called self-containment, the discipline of keeping one's sense of value rooted in internal judgment rather than external response. Epictetus, who was enslaved for much of his life and had every reason to understand the mechanics of powerlessness, taught that the only things truly within our control are our own judgments, desires, and will. When your self-worth is anchored internally, external approval loses its leverage. When it is anchored externally, even subtle rejection has the power to destabilize you completely. Most people miss this not because they are unintelligent, but because the craving for approval feels so natural that it seems like it must be a neutral fact about themselves, rather than a vulnerability that can be managed and minimized. Through deliberate practice, the deeper error is announcing insecurities in hopes of receiving reassurance. It seems logical. It even works sometimes, in the short term, in relationships where genuine care exists. But in the wider social world, the reassurance you receive in exchange for an admission of neediness quickly becomes transactional. The person reassuring you now knows the price of your cooperation, and prices once established tend to be revisited when the buyer needs leverage. Closely related to this is the danger of openly admitting that you feel inferior in a competitive space. You may be learning, you may be new, you may be genuinely humbled by the skill and experience of the people around you, and that humility is an asset internally. As an internal orientation, it makes you coachable, observant, and patient. But broadcasting that inferiority is an entirely different matter. It assigns you a position in the hierarchy before you have had the opportunity to demonstrate your actual capabilities, and hierarchies resist revision. People rarely update their initial assessments upward without being overwhelmed by evidence, and even then, the update comes slowly and grudgingly. Imagine entering a new team and immediately confessing that you are intimidated by everyone's skill level. The admission sounds humble. It sounds self-aware. But what you have functionally accomplished is to anchor the perception of the group. Now, when you perform well, it registers as a pleasant surprise rather than the confirmation of an expectation. You are fighting against the frame you yourself constructed. You are spending energy trying to revise an assumption you introduced. Machiavelli warned rulers not to appear weak during periods of transition, not because they were not genuinely learning, not because uncertainty was not present, but because first impressions harden with extraordinary speed into assumptions that then function like invisible walls, constraining how far and how fast you can grow in a given environment. Strength does not need to be loud. It does not require performance or pretense. But insecurity, once spoken aloud, has a way of echoing long after the moment that produced it has passed. There is another dimension of this that concerns long-term strategy. You should never admit your deepest ambitions and plans to people who are not fully aligned with your success. Ambition generates excitement. The vision of where you are going, the plan you have constructed, the moves you intend to make, all of it is alive inside you and wants to be shared. There is a particular pleasure in telling people what you are building before it is built, in receiving their enthusiasm as a form of early validation. But vision shared too early with the wrong audience invites interference, and interference wears many faces. There is also the quiet death that comes from premature articulation itself. When you describe a vision in vivid detail to a receptive audience and receive genuine enthusiasm in return, your brain registers a form of social completion. The reward circuit fires, the dopamine arrives, and because the brain does not discriminate perfectly between the pleasure of accomplishing something and the pleasure of being congratulated for intending to accomplish it, the motivation to actually do the work subtly diminishes. You have already received the social reward. The hunger that drives execution has been partially fed. This is why the most productive creators, builders, and strategists across history have shared a common discipline. They revealed results, not intentions. They showed you the finished architecture, not the early sketches. They announced arrivals, not departures. Some people will doubt your plan and share that doubt with others, slowly eroding the social confidence that makes bold moves possible. Some will feel threatened by your trajectory and quietly position themselves to compete with you before you have established your advantage. Some will simply lack the imagination to see what you see, and their skepticism will drain you at precisely the moment when you most need your energy directed outward rather than spent defending your vision. Robert Greene, building on Machiavellian principles, speaks at length about the strategic value of concealing intention, not as an invitation to deception, but as a form of protection for the momentum that every ambitious project requires in its early stages. When people cannot predict your trajectory, they cannot obstruct it efficiently. When you are opaque, you retain the advantage of surprise, and surprise, in competitive environments, is one of the most powerful strategic assets available. Most people undermine themselves by seeking applause before results exist, by converting private energy into public declaration before the work is done. The discipline is to let the work speak, to act quietly, to arrive rather than announce. Another confession that weakens you is admitting, openly and in the wrong company, exactly how easily you are hurt. You may process deeply. You may carry wounds that go back decades. The sensitivity you experience when certain things are said to you or done to you may be entirely understandable given what you have lived through. But once someone knows the specific geography of your pain, they possess a shortcut. In moments of conflict, under pressure, during competition, that shortcut may be used. Not always with conscious cruelty, sometimes with complete unconsciousness, the way a person in an argument reaches instinctively for whatever seems likely to end the discomfort fastest. You argue with someone who knows that abandonment is your central terror, and suddenly they become strategically unavailable. You negotiate with someone who knows that rejection destabilizes you, and silence becomes their primary tool. You work alongside someone who knows that being dismissed is your oldest wound, and they begin to introduce a subtle condescension that is just difficult enough to articulate, that challenging it makes you seem oversensitive. Information creates asymmetry, and asymmetry in any contest of will tilts toward the person who holds more of it. Similarly, you should never confess that you lack clearly defined limits on what you will tolerate. If the people around you come to sense that you will absorb mistreatment, in order to avoid confrontation, they will test that limit. Not necessarily with malice, often simply through the ordinary human tendency to take what is available and push against boundaries until they meet genuine resistance. A late response, a dismissive remark, an unreasonable request delivered with the confidence of someone who has not encountered pushback, a joke made at your expense in front of others. Individually, each of these is small. Cumulatively, they define the structure of your relationships, and the structure you allow to form in moments of comfort will be the structure that governs you in moments of need. Nietzsche observed that the instinct to dominate is not essentially cruel, it is definitional. Human beings exist in social hierarchies, and hierarchies require definition. In the absence of clearly established limits, others will establish them by default. When you tell someone plainly, and perhaps without meaning to, that you simply cannot tolerate conflict, you have handed them the governing principle of your relationship. What follows is not aggression. It is simply the logical filling of available space. The antidote is not aggression in return. It is what can be called quiet firmness, the kind of boundaries that do not need to be shouted because they are absolutely consistent and therefore absolutely legible to anyone paying attention. There is one more admission that carries particular danger in competitive settings, and that is the confession of envy. Envy is human. It is, at its core, an emotional signal pointing toward unmet desire, toward something you want that someone else has. As a private orientation, it can be useful. It shows you what you value, what you are reaching toward, what gaps exist between where you are and where you intend to go. But when you confess envy to the person you envy, or to anyone in their social orbit, you accomplish several things at once, none of them beneficial to you. You elevate the person you envy in the hierarchy of the shared environment. You lower yourself in that same exchange. You establish them as the standard against which you measure your own progress. You convert a private aspiration into a public admission of insufficiency. Machiavelli would have suggested studying rivals carefully and privately, extracting whatever principles and patterns can be learned from their success, and then applying those lessons with enough discretion that the source is not apparent. There is nothing wrong with admiration. There is everything strategically costly about announcing it to the person being admired in a context where the two of you are in any form of competition. When you stop publicly confessing insecurity, envy, approval-seeking, fragile limits, and unfinished plans, something changes. Not in your external circumstances immediately, but in you. You become contained, and containment creates a quality that is very difficult to describe accurately, but absolutely unmistakable when you encounter it in another person. It is a kind of gravity, a settled, calm, self-possessed quality that communicates that this person is not easily moved, not easily impressed, not easily threatened, and not easily used. People sense stability and are drawn to it. More importantly, they are less likely to test it than they would be to test obvious anxiety or apparent need. Consider also the specific danger of admitting that you have no options. Desperation is detectable without being articulated. The body communicates it, the voice communicates it, the pacing of decisions communicates it. But verbal confession of desperation amplifies the signal dramatically and immediately shifts the balance of any negotiation, any relationship, any professional situation in which you find yourself. If someone knows that you cannot walk away from a deal, they will offer you worse terms. If someone knows you cannot afford to lose a relationship, they will invest less in maintaining it. If someone knows your current position is your only position, they will treat you accordingly. Even when your alternatives are genuinely limited, projecting calm suggests choice, and choice is the foundation of leverage. The goal is never to lie about your circumstances. It is to refuse to verbally corner yourself in moments when the stakes are high. The ability to project calm under pressure is itself a skill that can be developed, and it begins with the internal discipline of refusing to catastrophize. When you find yourself in a situation where your options feel limited, the instinct is to narrate that limitation, to say it aloud, to share it, to have it witnessed. Resist that instinct, not because silence will change your material reality, but because silence preserves the perception of agency, and perceived agency creates actual options. When people believe you can walk away, they try harder to give you a reason to stay. When they believe you have nowhere else to go, they stop trying entirely. The negotiating room you create through composure is real. It is not theater. It is one of the most practical applications of the containment principle in daily life. It is essential to be clear about what this framework is not. It is not a call to become secretive in the paranoid sense, constructing walls around yourself so thick that genuine connection becomes impossible. It is not an argument for chronic dishonesty, for performing a version of yourself designed purely for strategic effect. It is not a philosophy for the cold or the calculated. It is a call for discernment, for the discipline to understand that honesty and exposure are not the same thing, and that maturity in social environments involves understanding the difference. You can be honest without being reckless. You can be emotionally genuine without being an open book to every person who crosses your path. You can share your fears, your wounds, your ambitions, and your struggles with the people who have earned that access through demonstrated loyalty, demonstrated care, and demonstrated alignment with your well-being. The filter is not secrecy. The filter is trust, and trust is built slowly through consistent action over time. Before someone has demonstrated that they are genuinely on your side, the appropriate level of disclosure is professional warmth, not emotional transparency. The distinction matters enormously. Most people confuse openness with maturity. They mistake unfiltered disclosure for authenticity, as if the truest version of yourself is always the most exposed version. But this conflates authenticity with recklessness. The most authentic version of yourself is not necessarily the most vulnerable version. It is the version that knows who it is clearly enough to choose, deliberately and without performance, what to share and what to protect. The mature individual does not simply download their inner world onto whoever happens to be present. They choose timing, audience, and context with care, because they understand that words, once spoken, cannot be recalled, and that the impressions they create become the ground on which all future interactions stand. When you master this discipline, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling the compulsive urge to explain yourself to everyone who appears to misunderstand you. You stop oversharing in moments of anxiety because you have learned to process anxiety internally rather than externally. You stop confessing fears to people who have not proven that they will handle those fears with care. You begin to develop what can only be called a genuine interior life, a rich, private, constantly developing sense of who you are and where you are going, that does not require constant external validation in order to remain stable. The noise of other people's opinions gradually loses its power over your direction. You strengthen privately. You process internally. You build with the patience of someone who understands that the most enduring structures are not raised quickly, and that the work done in the quiet is often the most important work of all. And then you act from a place of groundedness rather than reaction, from clarity rather than urgency, from a settled sense of identity that needs nothing from the audience to remain whole. This is sovereignty. Not the performative version, not the carefully curated social media projection of someone who appears unbothered by things that should bother them. The real thing. The kind built over time through the slow, unglamorous discipline of choosing restraint when exposure would feel easier, choosing silence when confession would feel like relief, choosing to trust the work over the announcement of the work. It is a sovereignty that cannot be taken from you because it was never granted to you by others in the first place. You built it from the inside, not the performative version, not the carefully curated social media projection of someone who appears unbothered. The real thing. The kind that comes from genuinely not needing the approval of people who have not earned the right to evaluate you. The kind that comes from understanding your own worth clearly enough that withholding it is not an act of withdrawal but of discernment. You do not lie about who you are. You do not construct a false persona and inhabit it until you no longer know where the performance ends and the reality begins. You simply refuse to hand out the blueprint to dismantle you. You refuse to give people the map of your soft spots before they have demonstrated that they will not use it. You hold the fullness of yourself in reserve until the relationship, the context, and the demonstrated character of the other person justify the gift of genuine access. This asks for restraint in a culture that is deeply addicted to exposure. The current social environment rewards confession. It incentivizes public vulnerability, public struggle, public admission of every insecurity and doubt as evidence of relatability and realness. The algorithm rewards the tearful post. The brand rewards the radical admission, and for many people in many contexts, that is an honest and courageous choice. But it is not a universal strategy, and in the environments where power matters, where competition is real, where the stakes of being read accurately or inaccurately have genuine consequences for your trajectory, containment is not weakness dressed up as strength. Containment is strength. There is a word that needs to be rescued from the popular misreading that has weakened it: private. To be private is not to be ashamed. It is not to be hiding in the sense that implies something worth hiding from. Being private is the declaration that your inner world has value, that your developing self deserves protection, that not every thought you think needs to become content for the consumption of others. Privacy is a form of self-respect. It is the acknowledgement that you are not merely the sum of your publicly expressed experiences. You are something richer, more complex, and more worth protecting than a feed of admissions would suggest. The people who command genuine, durable respect in any environment, the individuals who are listened to when they speak, sought out when decisions need to be made, trusted when the stakes are highest, are almost never the people who shared the most. They are the people who revealed the right things to the right people at the right moments, having first established through consistent behavior that they were someone whose words carried weight. They built that weight through restraint as much as through expression, through what they chose not to say as much as through what they chose to say. The particular strength of knowing that not everything you feel needs to be said, not everything you plan needs to be announced, and not everyone around you has earned the version of you that you are still becoming. This is not coldness. It is not emotional avoidance or the suppression of authentic feeling. It is the disciplined recognition that the self is not a public utility, that you are allowed to develop, to struggle, to doubt, and to grow in spaces where the audience is carefully chosen and genuinely trustworthy, rather than broadcasting each stage of becoming to whoever happens to be nearby. If this message resonated, it means you already sensed that some truths are not meant for every ear. Subscribe if you want to explore these dynamics further. The algorithm rewards confession. It does not reward containment. Containment builds power, and power rarely announces itself. It simply arrives and stays.